Hello and welcome to our panel discussion celebrating UCD's architecture at Belfield. This discussion around campus architecture and the development of UCD at Belfield is part of a celebration of space and place called Belfield 50, which is unfolding through 2020 and 2021. My name's Ellen Rowley and I'm an architectural historian based in UCD's School of Architecture. And I've been tasked with looking back at Belfield's origins so as to understand the significance of the place. And I'd like to acknowledge the help of various archives, including Wejchert Architects and the Irish Architectural Archive, as well as UCD Estates and UCD Special Collections. So, as Ireland's first purpose-built, coherently modern campus, Belfield fundamentally changed the spatial identity of Irish universities. UCD commissioned the foremost modern architects of the period to design a groundbreaking educational environment at Belfield. And that project sought to emancipate itself from the traditional quadrangles of older Irish colleges. This new campus, designed by a young Polish architect, Andrzej Wejchert, who had won UCD's International Architectural Competition in 1963, modified a distinguished old suburban landscape to create a place for learning, sport and university life. And I should say that that suburban landscape was made up of no less than 11 separate domains, which were acquired by UCD over a period from 1933. So today we have invited 4 architects to consider Belfield. All 4 have contributed to the shape of this place, either directly or through their practice or through their family legacy. Thank you all for taking part, and let me introduce you. First off, UCD's Professor of Architecture, Hugh Campbell, will convene the conversation. So thanks, Hugh, for coming on board. Thank you and welcome to Ronan Phelan. Maybe you'd wave when I introduce Ronan. Welcome. Ronan is a director at Scott Tallon Walker Architects, and Ronan recently led the design of the UCD Club, while his firm, Scott Tallon Walker, has had a long history at Belfield, ranging back to Robin Walker's gold medal winning restaurant building of 1970 and on to Ronnie Talon's O'Reilly Hall of 1995, to name a few. Valerie Mulvin, thank you for joining us. Valerie is a renowned graduate of UCD Architecture, and her practice, of which she's a founding director, McCullough Mulvin Architects, has designed award-winning university buildings in Ireland and India, namely newly finished structures for Thapar University in the Punjab region of India. In 2003, Valerie designed the extension to the Virus Reference Lab, today a frontline building of critical importance. Denis Brereton, welcome. Denis, partner, hi Denis, is a partner at Robinson Keefe and Devane Architects, that's RKD, where he leads healthcare and educational projects for the firm. And RKD is the firm which, or rather to which, Wejchert was associated through the earliest phase of Belfield's development. More recent collaboration has seen RKD develop the Quinn, then Moore School of Business, extend UCD's science blocks to make the O'Brien Centre, design the Charles Institute and UCD Veterinary facilities, while RKD are currently working on UCD's Centre for Future Learning. Last but very much not least, we are delighted to welcome Agnieszka Wejchert Pearson, who is an architect and a partner in Mundo Architecture in the UK. Her father, Andrzej Wejchert, designed Belfield's original master plan, and Agnieszka will reflect on the role of Belfield in her parents' architectural practice. So thank you all, and I'll hand over to Hugh to convene.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thanks to everybody for convening remotely, as we are wont to do these days, to talk about, in a way, maybe somewhat ironically, to talk about a campus that's intended to bring people together, and premised on ideas of collegiality and of gathering. But nonetheless, we hope that it won't be too long before we're able to do convene in real space again. I might just start, I suppose, by going to each of the three architects who have built on the campus to talk a little bit about their experience. And each project, I think, I mean, in one sense, the campus presents itself as something continuous and continuously evolving, and something that exists at a very large scale. But within it, I think each project, and even projects that don't get built as much as projects that do get built, is a very complex story in its own right. Lots of different sort of people involved, different stakeholders, complexities of site, complexities of brief, and so on. So I think what we want to do is just maybe in turn talk a little bit, or get a sort of snapshot of what it's like to work on a particular project in Belfield in those terms. So Valerie, maybe I would go to you first to talk a little bit about the virus reference library. And as Ellen says, right now, that building is probably at the epicenter of, and some of the people who you would have worked with on the building are very much in the public eye, and right at the heart of the crisis we're working our way through. Could you say something a little bit about maybe the purpose of the project, the functions that it houses, and how it then came into being as a need that was identified, and then as a building that you began to work on?
Okay, yeah. I suppose I'd say, first of all, this probably has to be the smallest building in UCD. It sits on a bluff overlooking the lake. It's a tiny site right at the back of a 19th century house, which is Ardmore House. It's hemmed in between this and the medical microbiology lab, but it was designed to be seen within the context of Andrzej Wejchert's seminal 1960s masterplan for UCD. And that, I suppose, from an architectural point of view, is an architectural promenade of pieces connected to a spine, rather than an open green suburban landscape. So that's a really interesting place to start. The building was, above all, it was an experiment really in displacing space. So it's like this integral box with its own reliance on geometry and scientific motion. The experiment is like dropping a liquid into another liquid to see what happens. And here in this case, we were dropping this tiny pavilion into the strange leftover space at the back of Ardmore House to resolve that and to turn to face the lake. So in a way, we were saying we wanted to explore the spaces between, to drop a simple autonomous block into a space and work with the biology, if you will, of what happened, the block and its connective tissue, kind of grafting it onto other laboratory spaces. And that made a kind of figure ground, which made a new positive space out of that leftover space. So the site plan, we kind of invented a mathematical resolving geometry to harness all these floating elements and connect to the site features, a fragment of the walled garden of Ardmore House, the lake, which was part of the Wejchert plan, the wall of microbiology, and we made this kind of triangle of natural materials. And then the floor of that space was poured concrete with timber sleepers dropped into a river. The concrete was acid washed to expose the pebble in the aggregate, and we got big boulders of granite from Wicklow Quarry, and we put them there as a drift of accidentals. So it was kind of like the elusive power of stone to suggest weight and randomness and the brilliance of scientific ideas set against the taut lightness of this little timber pavilion. And you can really describe the VRL extension as a building for an individual rather than for UCD in a way. We worked with its then director, Professor Bill Hall, and his energy and drive and interest made the building kind of come into being over our conversations. His brilliance made it very individual, and his grasp of the possibilities of the language of architecture to bring meaning to functional space sparked our conversations. So it was really great to work with him. And he also transmitted his excitement in his own research to us. So we had fantastic accounts of the process of tracing viruses and following leads, and amazing stories of field trips to Asia or the Amazon basin and taking blood samples from indigenous people to follow viruses and plot transmission. And because he'd been to all parts of the globe, he had a huge interest in things like Japanese gardens and borrowed landscape. And so we had a lot of intense discussions about harnessing the power of landscape as a kind of contemplative thing to put exterior and interior places together as places to reflect after the intensity of the lab. So a bit like Salk, the Salk Institute in California, where Louis Kahn said, you experiment, you reflect, and then you write up the inspiration. And so in the same way, we were trying to make an interior garden to get away from the pressures of the lab, within that old wall garden of Ardmore. And it can be read at a huge level. So we took on the idea of mathematics and science to make a language for the new pavilion, with the idea of cells and their fluid relationships into a way of thinking about the program. So the program was like a cell, which was the core, with functional spaces linked to it, like cells that had become differentiated. And it was a really simple program. It was like labs supported by a flexible social hub for staff and students, which was looking out over the lake. And the lab spaces overspill like cells in the process of dividing and splitting off into the adjacent building, where there's a reception point for samples coming in from all over the country. And then there's a relationship of connections between the pavilion and the arrival space and the secret interior garden. So all that kind of connected a really straightforward plan. So we clad it in timber over a steel frame. It is really taut and light. It's a container.
What we see from the lake is really this timber pavilion, as you describe it. I mean, it's quite a striking, because, as you say, it's quite a small, distinct form.
Yeah.
So a lot of the projects made are quite a large scale, and part of that then is that the idea that, as you were mentioning, Billy Hall, that there's this very particular character and this very particular kind of almost intellectual frame of reference that you're trying to respond to. I suppose that might be a particular of working in the university, that one comes across people like that. You're trying to respond to what's driving them. And was that the case with this? It seems to have been a kind of an interesting conversation.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, we some people, when you have a client, I always think that good clients get good buildings, in a sense. And buildings where they really drive ourselves as architects, and they drive the program, and they push everything to the limit. And it's really great, because in this case, we were able to talk about, the windows being flush rather than recessed in certain places, to give a kind of a sense of this skin containing everything inside it, like the skin of a cell. And
your use of timber, because again, the timber is quite distinct in the context of UCD. It's not.
Yeah, it was a bit of an experiment.
A predominant idiom, let's say, of the campus.
It's hard to get the buildings office to buy into it, and I think they were worried they'd have to maintain it. And when we said, no, we actually want the timber to fade to a sort of a silvery grey, they kind of relaxed a bit and said, okay, well, let's try it. It's not a very big area. So I think it's kind of, we use the timber with the boards vertical and horizontal to kind of create shadows and so on. So it's very much like a sort of a Japanese thing about light screens that fold over each other and pivot and give that sense of, I suppose, breaking down the filters between inside and outside. And we were hoping this building would break down the filters between this building and the rest of UCD, and kind of take part in the master plan and take part in the amazing relationship with the lake, which not many buildings in the master plan can deal with.
And as it happens, the three projects that we're talking about all have that lakeside setting in common. I mean, Denis, maybe I'm just thinking maybe of going to your project, because of course you're facing the O'Brien Centre for Science is the project that I'm thinking of. I know that at the moment you're also working in Ardmore House, directly behind the building we're hearing, and indeed on the future campus project as well. But the Science Centre probably was not driven in the same way by an individual or a very particular set of needs. I guess it had to respond to a much more, let's say, heterogeneous mixed set of demands and different, a jealousy of professors and like all kinds of very difficult groups to get to talk to each other, to agree with each other. What was that process like, trying to respond to all of those complex needs and keep everyone satisfied?
In a word, well, in a number of words, it was like herding mice at a crossroads. The truth be told, it was, you're perfectly right. There were so many conflicting aims. And in fact, all of that and the complexity was compounded by a large sense that the university were also very keen to ensure that the building design appealed to a generous benefactor. And a number of benefactors were shortlisted at the time. And one of the fine lines we had to thread really was to ensure that we were make a building that was fit for purpose, fit for place, sat comfortably within the campus environment, and at the same time, without it being an audacious exercise in bling, was going to satisfy the a potential benefactor. As it happens, the benefactor who eventually sort of ponied up, as it were, was not of that opinion at all, and indeed was quite a modest man, and his name now sits on the building happily. But one of the things that we were first charged with was the possibility of not building on that site at all, but building on a greenfield site out on the periphery of the campus. And we really challenged that. And our determination was to turn what was potentially becoming something of a science ghetto into a science quarter, and indeed more than that, really a new quarter for the university. And what we've ended up with, quite in contrary to the Virus Reference Lab, is a very substantial building sitting in the same context as Valerie's building, but doing a very different thing. And one of the things that we were really concerned to ensure is that we could take a series of now master sell-by date science buildings, which had sort of were siloed very much in their thinking, and likewise the jealousy of practitioners, equally siloed, to create a single entity which was not just about science, but went well beyond that and became a tremendous new place for the campus, and also which would help to kill what was a very windy and windswept side of the campus, with what had become, which had set out as quite charming buildings, have become quite dated in their appearance and in their use. Happily, the fundamental structure of those buildings and their spacing was such that we were able to satisfy the desire for a greenfield building within a brownfield site, because there was plenty of greenfield around, which meant we could widen the existing buildings, we could extend them to make them more efficient, and we could then use what I think is quite a modest arrangement of atria and openings to gardens to glue all those disparate parts together. And of course the building is big and it's unapologetically big. But one thing we're really concerned to ensure is that although it was that in terms of its materials, in terms of its scale, in terms of its detail, that it's set comfortably within the environs of, for example, the Virus Reference Lab, the Aula Maxima, the library building, etc., so that it wouldn't be a sort of a heavy hitter in that context. So great care was given to that.
But just Denis as well, I'm conscious that there was also an interest in new modes of teaching. I mean, like moving.
Oh, very much so. I mean, you talked earlier about the value of collaboration and collegiality and congregation of people, which must be at the heart of all universities, going back to Plato and Aristotle and the great philosophers, where people literally would meet at a forum. And one of the things we were really concerned to do was to ensure that we killed the idea of a siloed science ghetto, and we would create a place for chance encounter, a place for people to meet, a real forum. And and one thing, for example, we did is we put all the labs on view, that you can walk through the building and into the labs like showcases. So you can actually see what happens within the building. But in addition to that, although labs by their very nature tend to be introverted spaces, we wanted them to open out into public space, and that public space in turn open out into the greater sort of university realm. It was very important to the thing. Also, of course, there was at the heart of the building were a series of now dated or then dated lecture theatres, and again we wanted to ensure that element could play its part and participate in the overall complex. So really the idea was to break down the silos in science and then break down science as a sort of an entity within the overall sort of university milieu.
Between the students and the staff and the faculty that sort of start to encourage a more open and dynamic kind of relationship.
Very, very, very much so. And indeed, as you know, part of the brief was to create places that were unidentifiable as in terms of ownership. And at one stage, we contemplated, in fact, in the middle of the atrium, putting a giant inflated sort of a castle that people would actually could have play place. People would play
there actually. Yeah. Okay.
Sadly, it never came to pass. It was going to be a sort of a great bouncy castle, but it never came to pass. But the thinking came to pass, and I think that was the important thing.
Okay. And then just to turn to Ronan, then I mean maybe not using the bouncy castle as a segue necessarily, but just coming back to the lake and the idea then of third side of the lake, we have O'Reilly Hall for a long time sitting as this temple, I suppose, the place where the university gathers for graduations and major occasions, a Scott Tallon Walker project. And then the invitation to you more recently was to effectively make a new wing to that, or an addition to it, for this, again, a different kind of function again, the University Club, which was, I suppose, a project that was about making a different kind of gathering place, in this case for the faculty and staff, remembering that there's something like 3,000 of them, dispersed across the campus, that this would become a place where people could go, an amenity. And how was that brief conveyed to you? What did you understand as being the aims?
Well, this project really had its origin, it was the brainchild of President Deeks, and he recognized that this type of facility, which really, this kind of faculty club base, exists in all of the great universities worldwide and in other universities around Ireland, and that function was really completely lacking in UCD. So there was kind of two ideas behind the University Club. The idea was that it would create a space where obviously the faculty and the staff could meet together both socially and professionally. So they could meet and chat, socialise, grab a quick bite, or relax in kind of informal lounge settings. But it's open not only to staff, but also it's for graduates of the university, the alumni. And also it encourages and welcomes like the business and academic partners of the university. So it's a place where you could offer hospitality to a visiting lecturer or a visiting faculty, or a guest lecture on campus, and also a place that, what Denis touched on, somewhere where you could invite a donor and welcome them into the university, in the university environment, in the campus. And the location and the setting of the club next to O'Reilly Hall is key there, because on the first floor where we put the formal dining room, you have this fantastic view south over the formal pond, and you're looking at some of the great original set pieces of the university, the arts building, the Veterinary building, and then the new sciences campus is on the right, and then the smaller buildings like Valerie's building on the left.
Yeah, so it's a place you kind of get a prospect. Was it always the intention that that would be the site, that it would work in conjunction with O'Reilly Hall? And
well, I suppose the second aspect of the building is, while it has its own identity and it functions as a club, by building it as an extension to O'Reilly Hall, it kind of reinforces the idea of O'Reilly Hall as a conference venue. I mean, you touched on the original design of O'Reilly Hall, which is this very classical building that sits in a formal setting and overlooks the lake. And it was originally designed as the Aula Maxima for the graduation, so it seats, I think, 1,100 people, as well as accommodating, banqueting. I think you can seat 500 in a banqueting event. But I think the university always loved that building particularly because of the ability to, I suppose, welcome the graduates and have the conferring ceremony on campus in that very nice setting. And like many of the listeners, and particularly graduates, be familiar with the experience of the conferring in UCD and then spilling out onto that lovely south-facing lawn and taking photographs and things like that. So by using the club as an extension to that, you're kind of upping the game, you're kind of reinforcing it as a conference facility. So the way we designed it now, if you have a big conference in the hall, you can now come through, we've connected it through with a concourse space, and you can break out then from the conferences and use the informal cafe or the informal dining room or the seminars and breakout spaces. So it turns that whole building into, I suppose, a much better functioning entertainment venue. And it's, for me, it's very much part of the outreaching of the university. So it's a building that's very much part of the campus and celebrates the design and the centre and the activity of the campus, but it's also one of the key buildings that attracts the public in and kind of broadcasts the university to a wider audience.
It's funny, it's one of the things that strikes me about it is that it discovers a bit of territory that otherwise would not have been thought to be there. A little bit similar to Valerie's building, actually. I mean, that and it makes a place. I mean, you kind of get a little bit of a crossroads. You've got the computer science veterinary buildings, you've got the science building, and then your building, and then there's access from coming from the outside. So there's a sort of whole new front.
Well, it's the site that never was. It's actually built on the site of the service yard to O'Reilly Hall. Yeah. And it's kind of, it's interesting because it presented two challenges. One was the challenge of making a building that was complementary to O'Reilly Hall and that had its own identity, while at the same time not challenging that very formal set piece onto the lake. Yeah. But you quite rightly say, as you come around the corner to the western elevation, it's a different environment. And that linkage, I think, is very interesting because I think it's key to the positioning of a lot of buildings in UCD, that axis is set up by the fact that there's a kind of a bus stop on the dual carriageway at that point. So you get quite a lot of people coming that way, coming through the car park. Yeah. And it's an axis which serves veterinary and sciences and then leads you on perhaps to the library. So in terms of the design of the building, we were quite well-mannered and well-behaved along the line of the elevation of O'Reilly Hall. As you come around the corner, we took a bit more of a relaxed view, and the building is splayed with sort of a double height garden, which is the cafe that links the cafe visually downstairs to the more formal dining upstairs. And that space is splayed and glazed, and it relates to the geometry of veterinary. But at the same time, that splaying and suppose canting of the building creates a little threshold space. It's not a plaza and it's not a square, but it's a little formal threshold space, kind of a pause before you enter into the building.
It's interesting, isn't it, that this sense that the campus is never finished. It's always in some iteration of itself. It's always in some, and we know it, and then something new arrives, and you see something else, or a new connection is made, or an old connection is rediscovered, or an older building is reimagined. And I might just hand back over now to Ellen, because I think, Ellen, you want to go back a little bit to the sort of first origins of the campus, that Andrzej Wejchert's masterplan. Think a little bit about that and its history.
Yeah, well, thanks, Hugh. We were thinking about why did Wejchert win the design? What was it that really wooed the competition judges, who were a team of local, very modernist inclined architects, and then a civil engineering prof, Michael Hogan, and then two international judges. But they seem to be really taken by Wejchert's master plan because actually of this. I think it's fascinating. It's its incomplete nature, or its partial nature. They kept referring back to the walkways, and so the walkways are at once creating, as Valerie suggested, this stem, this kind of emphatic line that then cranks, and then I think it's the way that then this stem has buildings almost like I suppose petals or growths, this organic thing that can be stuck onto it or feed off the stem. So that, on the one hand, brings great cohesion. It also, because it's low-lying, it respects the landscape as something that's going to be low-lying. And really, I think one of the main points of potential and why the Wejchert plan continues to work and was chosen was that it always offered the potential for growth. And so this is very much the post-war reconstruction period, and the hangover of that, where this is really a period of unpredictable growth, and so that's happening kind of internationally, but then on a local level, in terms of the socio-educational history, we have the growth at this time of the third level sector, what's called higher education, and so within the 20 years rather before Wejchert's before the competition, between the late 30s and into the late 50s, the whole higher education sector it almost doubles, not more than doubles. So in 1939 there's about 5,000 students, and by 1959 there's almost 9,000. And then from when Wejchert moves into the campus, or rather when the competition is won in 1963. In UCD at that point, there's 4,728 students. Sorry to bombard you with numbers, but it is interesting. So 4,700 or so. And by 1985, so 20 years later, there's 10,177. So this need to grow is really important. And I think why Wejchert's plan wins is that on the one hand, it brings cohesion, and what Denis talks about, it champions the encounter, so that we're walking under this walkway and we can meet staff and students. But on the other hand, it's not too rigid, because there had been designs, as UCD was acquiring the land, there was designs made by a former professor of architecture, J.V. Downs, for around the Merville site and the woodland. And then that moved over to the Belgrove Valley, which is where Belfield, where the kind of the science building runs down to the road, to the main entrance. And but all of these designs were considered too rigid. There's a fear there of being too predictive or rather prescriptive.
Thank you, Alan. Agnieszka, I know that for you there's a whole, on the one hand, this is part of the official history of UCD and the official history really of Ireland, because UCD is a national university. But for you, of course, this is part of your childhood, the making of this campus, and because I suppose it represented the pretext on which your parents arrived into Dublin, and presumably played quite a major part in your early time here. Could you talk a little bit about the campus from your point of view?
Yes, I remember as a young child going there very often at weekends. My dad particularly loved to go there, and I think he was checking that the designs that he had in his head were working well in reality, and so he wanted to check. We would go often to the lake. We would go kind of across the campus. It was lovely at weekends because it was vacant, it was empty, pre any residential students on campus. So it was nearly like a private place. There would be boats with their motorized boats on the lake, and that was it. So it was nearly like an empty playground for us. I have lovely memories of in the car park, there were these islands where the trees, the horse chestnuts, had been preserved rather than just kind of flattening and chopping down the existing trees. They were preserved on islands, and we used to go there, my brother and I, with our father, and he would hoik us up onto the top of the islands, and we would be collecting horse chestnuts, which later he would make into animal models for us. But I also remember going on lots of biking, triking trips, and learning to roller skate on the ramps and the smooth concrete surfaces. It was a wonderful place to go to.
Were you living nearby at the time, or was this a sort of pilgrimage that you were making weekly, or an extended back garden for you?
We didn't live that close. We were living in Dalkey. So okay. I guess it would have been about a half-hour trip. Yeah. But I think that's what they told us. That's why they chose to live in Dalkey. So it was close enough that he could pop by on the way to work, or that we could get there easily enough on a weekend, that it was kind of part of, it was integrated into our growing up. Yeah.
So, and because of course one of the things about it is that in the initial phase, Alan mentioned, the numbers of students were, and there was nobody living on the campus. So it was a very different kind of place, bucolic, almost like a hidden world, as you say, particularly at the weekends. I don't know if you've been visiting more recently, or if you've felt the changes that have happened to it over, the decades since. Yes.
I went, probably it was about 6 years ago, to meet a student there, and I was shocked at the difference, because it was an evening, and it was a summer evening, and the campus was full, Many new buildings have arrived. It had a very different atmosphere. But it's progression. Right?
Yeah, and I have to say that I think that some of the qualities, the sort of open-endedness that Ellen referred to in the original plan, this idea of something sitting in landscape and not being too rigid,
yes,
is still supporting the life of the campus. I think is part of the reason that the landscape is still so present. And in fact, I think the landscape has become more to the forefront in recent years in terms of woodland walks and so on, but just a general feeling and understanding of that landscape and its presence. So I would have thought that that's a sort of testament to the enduring, what would you say, resilience of the original thinking that your father, and what an opportunity, I mean, for somebody at that relatively early stage of their career to be given, well, such a responsibility, but such an opportunity. I mean, did he talk about that aspect of it? That, like, it feels like he was certainly incredibly proud of it.
Yeah, I felt very lucky. It meant a lot to win the competition, because as well as the recognition from Ireland, it also meant a foot in the door into the West, leaving Poland and communism behind, which was actually half of their year group from architects left. Many went to the States, many went to France, but they were very happy to arrive in Ireland. So, yes.
And of course, it was a moment when, as Alan referred to, the university was in a way was in the process of reinventing itself. It was moving out of the city. It was moving to this suburban location. And I suppose in so doing, it had to think again about what the nature of a university is and should be. And that's one of the, maybe if I could just turn to that broader question now, and maybe come back to you, Valerie, because we've spoken in various ways, about the campus as a place of amenity, a place of learning, a place of research, very particular kind of lines of inquiry, that are a place where there's a very large working community, day by day, week by week, and then also a resident community now. So it's a settlement of over 30,000 people now, at its busiest, larger than Kilkenny, for instance. And yet at the same time, it's largely pedestrian in terms of how people move around it. It has a very particular kind of aspects. And I know you've worked a lot in campuses and you've built a lot of buildings in universities. So what's your take on how we build for the university? If I can put that broad question to you.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, because I like what Ellen was saying about this idea of the kind of the endless growth potential of Andrzej Wejchert's plan, which I think really does survive, and it's probably the strongest thing about UCD, that you have a sense of this routeway and you have a sense of landscape. And as a result, then, new buildings trying to create a sense of place within that is really important. And the set piece buildings that Ronan describes, they're very strong pieces. I know we'll come back and talk about favourite buildings and so on in it, but I do think there's a sense of being able to absorb large numbers of people. And that, I think, is a hugely important aspect of university campus planning, that you're not presented constantly with huge tranches of people, but that people can begin to make their own spaces within the environment that's there. So the potential to make small, environmentally suitable places is immensely important. And things like change of levels, change of materials, the way that buildings actually create space, and what Ronan was saying about actually creating, Denis was saying about creating kind of buffers to wind, because I mean, I remember UCD when we were students of architecture, we used to go out to UCD school only once a year, because we were in Earlsford Terrace. And you'd go out to UCD to go and sign on and register, and you queue up and end up going to the the Tierney building. But I always loved that connection between the Tierney building and the arts block, and those fabulously vertiginous lecture theatres, which were like Pergamon. And actually, when I much later on got to see Pergamon, I thought actually the same thing was.
It's like UCD, okay. But I mean, But even built in the name, in the amphitheatre, you know, the memory of the sort of earlier forms of gathering and so on that Denis also referred to. It's a very old idea, the idea of the campus, the idea of that kind of learning. And in fact, of course, Denis, just coming to you maybe and thinking about that, the Socratic idea and so on, that this idea of what's interesting about the Glacier plan is that so much of it is about how you get from one place to another. It's about the places, but it's also about the connective tissue, the famous walkways, the canopied walkways. I mean, is that connective tissue aspect of the university, is that something that you pick up on? Because again, I know you make a lot of buildings in campuses. You think a lot about educational architecture. Mm-hmm. What are the things that are on the
yes
working in that way?
There's no doubt about it. I think that placemaking is university architecture is fundamentally about placemaking, and those places are not the places I think that people normally associate with placemaking, which are really buildings, but it's very much the connective tissue between those buildings and the sort of environment that exists between them, where people move between university buildings probably more than they do any other form of building, I should think, except perhaps a busy retail street or something like that in a townscape. So that connective tissue is terribly important. And as a tribute to Andrzej, I remember meeting as a young architect when I designed the Vet College, and we won that in competition. For me, that was a very exciting prospect. And I met with Andrzej and spoke to him about the master plan, because that was one of the first buildings that actually broke the slightly orthogonal grid that had been formed, and I did so for very good reason, because it was a question of making the academic part of the building connect, and comes back to this issue of connection to the lake, and then to make the hospital part to connect to the more public realm of roadways and so on and so forth. So there was good purpose to it, but I was very conscious that it could well be seen as out of kilter. I remember speaking to Andrzej about that and meeting with him, and I was quite anxious about it, as you can imagine. I was meeting an elder lemon, as it were. I wasn't grey at that stage myself. So we spoke about it, and what struck me immediately was, first and foremost, how wonderfully self-effacing and how charming Andrzej was, and how receptive he was to discussing all of this. But also, it became absolutely apparent how resilient the plan was, and how it could in fact take quite a sort of a dent and a kick and so on and so forth. And I'm delighted to say that I've been personally involved in designing, I think it's 8 buildings now at this stage. I'm in the 8th building at UCD, and without exception, every single one of those has referred to the master plan and to that framework that was considered, which I think is very interesting. But I think a reason it works, I believe, and the more buildings that have been built and the more spaces that have been created have actually reinforced the value of that connective tissue, those connections between buildings. And I think it's rather like decent wine. I think it's going to improve with time, and it's extraordinary tribute to its resilience that you can actually add more buildings to that without destroying it, without ruining the purity, as it were, and the simplicity and the elegance of that plan.
In a way,
you are so right. I mean,
yeah. But also
isn't it?
Sorry, Valerie, jump in.
The generosity of that. It's the generosity of the original gesture. And as you said, Denis, Andrzej was such an amazing, modest person, very self-effacing, but at the same time strong. And I think that's a wonderful combination. Yes. Allows for openness, things to happen, and that kind of resilience and openness certainly affected me in my architectural development too.
But there's also the aspect of just the circumstance of the combining of those pieces of land to make what is very large estate within which to begin to build a university means that there's that room, there's always scope, there's room to maneuver. I mean, sometimes it's kind of like when you put furniture into an empty room and you make it seem bigger, because suddenly you're discovering the possibilities.
Yes.
Every time we add something,
I think that's a very interesting analogy. Yeah. I also think that sorry, Hugh, to interrupt you, but I also think that it's very interesting that it is at this relatively late stage in the development of the campus that the antiques, as it were, as in the original estate buildings that made up the space, are now finding a real place in there. And I think that's a very exciting prospect. So the likes of Ardmore House and the likes of the Clinton Institute building, and all of these are suddenly feeling comfortable in that new environment. And I personally find that's a great attraction. And again, it comes back to reinforcing that element of glue that can pulls all the various disparate parts together.
And of course, I hate to say it, but part of this Belfield 50 is the fact that we're now recognizing that first wave of university architecture, of the Belfield architecture, is itself now becoming, heritage is probably not the right word, but we have to think about it now in a different way. And one thinks particularly maybe of the Tierney building, the restaurant building, of course, as being, and I must say my own memory of the treks to Belfield, not from as far afield, but from Richview, which is on the other edge of the campus, or always to the restaurant building. You can tell I'm going to go to you on this, Ronan, because this is a Scott Tallon Walker building, and part of that, certainly the early era of Belfield development, and again seemed to have an idea about a very simple, straightforward idea about making a great gathering place for the student and staff community. Is that something that, and again, you've worked a lot on campus architecture, is that sense of wanting to make places where people can gather and come together, is that part of how you go about thinking about building in a university?
Who was that question for?
Ronan, sorry.
Well, that was a question for me. But I think you raised a very interesting point about the restaurant building, and I think it was one of the first buildings. It was built in about the 70s, so it was part of complementing the original master plan. And that restaurant was designed to serve the whole university at that point in time. But when you and I were in Richview, like you say, it was a trek across to Belfield, and difficult enough sometimes to find a centre. And for me, the restaurant building was the centre of UCD, and in many ways, it was the forum for UCD. And so just to describe a little bit about the building, I think it's on that very strong linear pedestrian axis that Andrzej set up. But the building is kind of designed in a dip. So it's a very simple structure with this kind of square building with a concrete roof supported on these ridiculously skinny columns. But because it's set in the dip, you kind of enter the building in the middle. So in the middle of the building are the social spaces. And upstairs was all the posh dining where the lecturers and everyone could have their proper dinner. But then it was connected with these lovely double height spaces. And then downstairs was this really, I suppose, democratic canteen. And what struck me about it is any time I visited it, and perhaps forum is too grand the word, but it seemed to be the one place where people from all different faculties, like friends who were doing law or business or commerce as it was at the time, or arts as referred to humanities, everybody was there. So that was the only big central space undercover in UCD where you could meet and greet. And those spaces, those inside spaces are just as important as the outside meeting spaces, because we all know we're in an Irish environment with the Irish weather, and the university year starts in the autumn and ends in spring, you know? So shelter and covering in UCD has always been a very important factor.
And of course, Denis also referred or touched on it, as did Valerie, that the particular character of the university building is you're going to have these great pulses of movement of people pretty much on the hour, every hour. And one feels it certainly in Belfield, less so in Richview where we are, it's quieter, but just everyone is on the move, and then everyone settles back again, and then everyone is on the move again. Yeah. So it actually gives a particular character to the architecture, doesn't it? That it has, in places, it has to have the capacity to absorb, to use Valerie's word, great numbers of people. And then at the same time, it has to serve very particular functions, and often very, very complex, like laboratory setups. And so it has a whole set of very specific functional.
That's a good point. And I think it's interesting to observe the people flow. And if you're building a building in UCD, as Valerie and Denis will know, you really need to look at that particular site and that particular place and study how people flow and move within the campus around that space. Because some of the most interesting spaces are made by almost accidental routes, what I would call like the kind of the desire line that the students and staff create through the university, which are not necessarily the lines along which the designers intended them to move. So the bus stop down on the motorway, the direct line from that bus stop up towards the Bank of Ireland building, then weaving around alongside the lake up towards the library, is one of the busiest axes, almost as busy as the linear axis cutting to the right angles. So when you come across a site in UCD, the opportunity, if you recognise where those desire lines are, that can inform the shape of the building, function of the building.
There's already a kind of latent intelligence there from how people are already moving. Ellen, you were going to come in on that point.
No, it was just funny. It was two things. I was just going to say that the restaurant was designed and at one point for however long, through the 1970s, maybe through the 80s, to serve 10,000 meals a day. Is that not a mad amount?
All the same as well, all the same.
yeah, exactly. And a very thin piece of meat, I believe. It's interesting that the second building where everybody finds themselves is also a building built at the same time, late 60s and finished in the early years of the 70s, which was phase one of John Hardy Glover's library, Basil Spence's practice, the Scottish practice. And so both of those buildings, Robin Walker's restaurant and the Spence Glover or Hardy Ferguson library are both built by other people to fit in, or by according to a different palette to fit into this Wejchert plan. And so again, it's referring to Valerie's generosity there, this inherent generosity of Andrzej's that is resilient and enduring.
There, Ellen, to say Alvar Aalto, when he was designing university campuses in Finland, I remember going to see one again when I was a penniless student, and trying to manage to live in Finland for even a week was an enormous challenge, involving tents and a lot of rain and so on. But the fabulous thing about, say, the Jyväskylä campus or the Otaniemi campus is that Aalto, when he finished these, he would kind of get somebody to go around with a barrow of sand. And what he had that person instructed to do was to follow where all the students were going. And every time he saw a student take a wandering path across a bit of landscape, that guy was instructed to go in with the barrow to go and drop a load of sand down along it, so that he would actually encapsulate the desire lines that everybody had. And I think that's a really interesting kind of thought about how do you make these connections. It's about observation, it's about instinct, but it's also about allowing people the possibility of deciding themselves, which is what you really want in a university, is for people to start learning what they are, who they are, where they might want to go, and to be and I think that's just one of the most wonderful things about those kinds of scenarios. And I thought that was a great story about Aalto and the barrow of sand.
It's also, the campus also tends to be an index of well, if I don't want to say societal change, but certainly changes in thinking about how society is structured, maybe. And so if we move from a situation where you've got single large gathering spaces to I would say now it's much more, there are smaller spaces distributed around the campus where people can convene and do all kinds of different things in all kinds of different ways. There's more variety, there's more choice perhaps. And then there's also this sense that to a large extent, there's an awful lot of what's now called learning commons, generally speaking. In other words, much less strictly denominated teaching space where students can be. They have a laptop, they can access the library. I'm always struck by the fact that the library now says it is at its busiest at midnight on a Sunday when it's closed, because that's when the most users are online. So the library, in a way, so many facilities are now available to students remotely, as we are discovering at the moment. So it also then says, well, then what is a campus? If it's the case that you can you can look at a lecture on your laptop, I don't know if you could yet design a building entirely without a studio, or do a science lab session without a lab. But nonetheless, the balance is shifting. And Denis, I know that you've been thinking about that in recent projects, where that need for these kind of just undenominated space where students can gather in group, just sit on their own. The demands are different, aren't they?
Sorry, Hugh, I missed your last word there. Apologies.
That maybe just to talk a little bit about that the changing demands, or I guess the changing nature of student life.
Oh yes, I think this comes back to the importance of place as opposed to the importance of building per se, and sort of nominating buildings per se, and that massive importance of congregation as social beings, as social species. I think yes, we do, of course, and we are learning very quickly to operate remotely. But that said, if of a poll of our 150 odd staff who are all working remotely and very successfully and very bravely and everything else, the one common denominator is that lack of physical touch, that lack of actually being able to talk to one another. And delightfully, it's our more junior staff, less experienced staff, are missing the idea of mentoring, direct mentoring. And you don't, from people who you might arguably expect a little arrogance in a sense that I can do it on my own. There's actually quite the opposite, that sense that what I'm really missing is mentoring. And I think what we're really about in university buildings and university space making is about recognizing the importance of that forum, the importance of that place where people can formally meet, or as I said a little earlier, can enjoy a chance encounter. And the surprise that comes from that. And I think there's those sort of spaces and those sort of pedagogical spaces are literally about opening opportunity for both surprise encounter and formal encounter. Yeah. And I don't think you get that.
Online.
You don't.
I'm interested that you're saying that the library in UCD is busiest before midnight on a Sunday. The library that we just built in India, to our total surprise, when we were going back there and doing kind of post-occupation studies and what have you, we discovered that the library was most used between 9 p.m. and 2 p.m. at night. And it wasn't just about the library as a facility, but it was the library as a meeting space.
As a meeting space, yeah.
Because there's a bit more segregation. Education.
We
always met girls.
The library.
Denis
recently completed a library for the University of Limerick, and it's very University of Limerick Library, calling itself a library per se, and the University of Limerick, and they'd admitted this themselves, are quite conservative in their attitudes generally, and they now are recognising the library as a meeting place and the importance of that, and as a forum, and they're using buzzwords like it's a maker space, and it's a place for invention and such like. In that library, in fact, one of the most fundamental things we've done is we've removed books from the library in the main, and they are stored in a central depository, which can be accessed quite easily. But we have opened the floors up, and that library is packed permanently.
I mean, I wouldn't have wanted
and there was a major debate as to whether it should ever happen or not. So I think I don't fear for. Yeah. The future of university buildings and those meeting places, those places for encounter. I think they're very important.
I should say that although the library is at its busiest on Sunday night, it's also really busy during the day. It's also really busy as a
jam-packed.
It's jam-packed, and actually they say they have a queue waiting when they open in the morning, partly because students are coming up on buses from all parts of the country, arriving in the campus, and don't have somewhere to go, don't have a base. So then the library is a really important space, that just gives you an anchor, a footing. But just to come back around, I'm also thinking about Agnieszka's description of the campus as another world, wandering through it and feeling and sort of thinking, I guess, that how important it is to have access. The feeling, I think, when you come as a student to a university is of entering a world where somehow learning and scholarship is valued, and freedom of thought, freedom of expression, all of these things. It embodies a certain sort of, and it makes you it puts you on your best performance, I think, in a way. Makes you up your game, or challenges you, but also supports you. And it's somehow that gets communicated, I think, doesn't it, through the campus and its architecture and its landscape. And maybe just to come back around to Agnieszka, and just thinking now about back to the specifics of the campus. Agnieszka, I wanted to ask if you had a favourite place, or maybe a building or a landscape or something that really struck you about Belfield during your visits there with your father, or maybe if you know that he had a favourite place within it.
Well, his favourite place was the lake. I know he loved that sense of openness, and I think it was kind of like a meeting place that he envisaged, a place where people could relax. But mine is something different. For me, the structure that I love most, probably out of all actually, is the water tower. So even beyond Belfield, out of their kind of lifetime's work. Yeah. And why it's become important, as a child at our home, we could go for walks and we'd look out across to Belfield, across the city, Dublin, to see, and you'd the water tower. And now I live in Wales, and it's like a beacon when I'm either arriving by ferry, or leaving, or even, by plane. I can spot the water tower. Somehow it's a very benevolent form. Yeah.
It's funny.
I like it.
Yeah, it's funny it took us so long to come around to it, but of course the water tower is such an important element. So you have the lake, which is sort of natural amenity at the centre, and then the landmark, which is the water tower, which is a sort of piece of a structure that is so idiosyncratic and yet seemingly inevitable, now to us. That it's kind of like an icon. Yeah.
It's an icon for Belfield, I think. Yeah.
Denis, how about you? Do you have a favourite Belfield place?
It's a very sort of partisan view. I like Belfield because Belfield is. I didn't study architecture at Belfield, but I practiced architecture at Belfield, and I'm proud of what's happened there, and I'm proud of because it has allowed. It allows you to create nice places. So I like Belfield overall. I feel a real fondness for it. If I have to choose a structure or a building, I'm slightly torn, and this is not designed to plumose Valerie in any way. I'm slightly torn between the Virology Reference Lab, which I've always liked as a jewellery box, sort of sitting in slightly, dare I say it, slightly incongruously amongst all of these quite masculine structures, and this delightful little box is sitting there, and it's a great surprise. And so I'm torn between that and the restaurant building, which to me represents one of the most iconic pieces of world architecture in this country. And there it is, sitting in the context of this campus, which is it's what a magical thing to own, to have a piece of work like that, as part of your built heritage. I think it's absolutely lovely and delightful, and I really would fight tooth and nail to protect it and make sure that it's always recognised as such. But Valerie, because you're in fact, goodness me, Ronan, I better be careful here what I say. I might tip the balance in favour of Valerie because she described her building such a charming way that I grew to like it even more.
Okay. But Valerie, do you want to?
By the way, you don't have to reciprocate.
Well, I know Ronan will be allowed to say that he likes the restaurant building because it's a Scott Tallon Walker building, but I'm right with you there, Denis. I think the restaurant building is a stunning building, and I loved. Even though when we used to go to the Tierney building to register, you're absolutely right, Hugh. I kind of forgotten because it was in the kind of pleasure sense of things that we always then used to go to there and probably to the bar in the end. But that sense of the levels, of the ingenuity of the levels, and this incredible sort of thing of holding up the column in the middle of the span and no columns at the corner. Yeah. It's just fantastic. Mm-hmm. And I'm just thinking, actually, in this 5th year, thinking about the whole campus, it'll be tremendously important to maintain the proper materiality of all those buildings. Like the Wejchert buildings with their beautiful bronze windows and lovely surfaces. And, you know, I mean, I know that the library, I kind of like it, but I like the exterior of it, but I don't really find the interior of it too conducive because it just doesn't seem to have enough ventilation or I don't know what. But there's a sense that there's edges of the campus where people could quite quickly destroy that very fragile sense of the 1960s and how optimistic and fantastic it was and what generous materials and beautiful materials were used in all of the buildings. And like that lovely sense of arrival when you come into the middle level of the restaurant building. I mean, it's unforgettable. So I think you're totally right, Dennis. Go tooth and nail to just protect those buildings. I think they're all, you know, there's a lot of very, very good buildings that UCD has built up as a kind of a lexicon. And it's wonderful. It's fantastic as a kind of our legacy to the next generation.
So we have a couple of votes, 1.5 at least for the restaurant. But Ronan, you're not allowed to go to the restaurant.
I'm not. And Hugh, when I got the list of potential questions for this discussion, I was always worried that I'd be asked last about favourite space on the campus because I could predict the structures like the Water Tower and Valerie's building would be picked and would be front runners. So I'm going to cheat slightly, and perhaps controversially, I'm going to nominate the quadrangle in Richview as being what was my favourite space in UCD, and I think that's because even though we were as part of Belfield, like you say, it took 20 minutes to walk there. So that quadrangle defined for us our own centre and our own little mini sense of campus. Now that will be rectified by the new Centre for Creative Design building, which will move architecture into the centre of the campus. But I always thought that was a lovely little space. It's quite a small space. It's kind of maybe half the size of a school football pitch along its length. But the way it's arranged with the library, the memorial hall, and the studios, there was such a constant traffic across that space that it was a really great social hub. And like my memory is that I went to literally 1984, so 85, spring of 85, there was a big snow, and I remember we had a big snowball fight in the middle of the quadrangle, and that snowball fight involved all 5 years throughout the Faculty of Architecture. And I probably met more people across the rest of the faculty during that one social interaction than in all the months coming up to it. So, and I think it's particularly relevant now since we've all been locked up in our homes for the last couple of months. I think everybody is now becoming much more conscious of the preciousness and the value of even the smallest outdoor public social space. And I just hope that I think there's a real opportunity that when people come back to work, that even socially, if we can just get an awful lot better at demanding better quality spaces like that, no matter how small they are, but really defending the quality and the integrity of those spaces. And I suppose demanding that they are preserved or even and designed into all walks of buildings, not only universities.
And again, it comes back to the point that so much of the success of the master plan was actually precisely about those spaces that bind us and bind places together, the stuff between, the spaces between. I want to draw Ellen, I know I'm not supposed to go to you on this question, am I? Or will I go to you on this question, or will we conclude?
No, I mean, you can conclude unless you really want to hear another thing from me, but you can conclude.
I'm kidding. But, no, I'm just conscious of time, and I know Valerie has got more time as well. But I suppose just to say, this is one of, I know, many events that are going to be happening to mark the 50th anniversary of Belfield. And I suppose what it's shown us already is the richness of the legacy of everything that has been built over the 50 years that Belfield has been in existence, and actually, I suppose, the promise that we're going to need to continue to build and to continue to invent and reinvent the campus over the coming 50 years and beyond. So I'd like to just thank our contributors very much. It was a very rich and interesting conversation that took us down, I think, some unexpected avenues, and also a chance to revisit some very familiar spaces and learn new things about them and gain new insights about a campus that we think we know, but that continues to surprise us. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much.